Snapshot of Vietnam's economy in 2014. Vietnamese governments to accelerate SOE restructuring. Hello, you're with me, Linh Hương from Hanoi, and thank you so much for tuning into our first edition of Bizline in this year of the goat. The goat is a symbol of harmony, peace, and tranquility. That's why, despite many volatilities recently, the global economy is hoped to find its balance this year. As for Vietnam, the country has been on its way to find its balance of economic growth and sustainable development. One of its efforts is to restructure enterprises with a focus on state-owned corporations and groups towards higher competitiveness and higher efficiency. This is also the topic of our crosstalk today. But before we get to that, let's take a look at the snapshot of Vietnam's economy for the last year.
Vietnam's GDP growth in 2014 is estimated at 5.98%, higher than the targeted 5.8% in the rate of 5.42% in 2013, according to the General Statistics Office under the Ministry of Planning and Investment.
Meanwhile, the growth of the average consumer price index in 2014 is only 4.09%, lower than the target of 7% set by the National Assembly. This makes 2014 the year with the lowest inflation rise in a decade.
The lower consumer price index is partly thanks to slumping oil prices. In the second half of 2014, Vietnam's RON 92 petrol went through 13 consecutive price cuts. It fell from a record high $1.20 per liter in July to about 81 cents per liter on December the 22nd. Petrol price continued to see cuts during the first month of 2015.
Vietnam received a new wave of foreign direct investment, or FDI, in 2014. As of mid-December 2014, registered FDI had reached $20.23 billion, thus surpassing the year's target of $17 billion. Most notable was Samsung's high-tech projects, which made it the biggest investor in the country, with $11.7 billion in registered capital.
In comparison, Vietnamese enterprises registered to invest a total of $1.78 billion abroad in 2014. In terms of sector, the investments were focused on telecommunications 54.3%, agroforestry, fishery 27.5%, and mining 6%.
The country recorded a trade surplus for the third consecutive year in 2014. Latest figures from Vietnam Customs show that there were increases in the value of both goods exports and imports. The resulting trade surplus was $2.14 billion, the highest ever.
International remittances from overseas Vietnamese for 2014 remain strong, tallying in at $12 billion, according to the State Bank of Vietnam (SBV). The SBV also said that the remittances were mainly channeled into business ventures. This was a change from previous years when they primarily went into real estate, stock, and saving accounts.
Eight is the number of bilateral and multilateral free trade agreements that Vietnam is currently a member of. This figure is set to rise to 10 in 2015 as the country expects to sign the free trade agreements with the Republic of Korea and the Customs Union of Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan.
The The goal of equitizing 432 SOEs before the deadline of 2015 led to a busy year in 2014 for transformation of the state sector. The year witnessed some notable IPOs of Vietnam Textile Garment Corporation, or Vinatex, Cà Fertilizer, and Vietnam Airlines with earnings of between $50 billion and $70 billion each. However, according to the Steering Committee for Business Renovation and Development, only 143 SOEs were equitized in 2014, well below the set target of 200. In our crosstalk this week, we'll review the SOE reform process and lessons from last year and discuss the remaining tasks for this year with Mr. Sandre Kala, resident representative of the IMF Vietnam. But before we talk, let's take a look at the following. From the beginning of 2015, Vietnamese government issued Resolution Number 1 requesting all ministries, departments and localities to accelerate restructuring SOEs with a focus on SOE equitization and divestment from non-core business. 2014 saw the equitization of 143 companies out of 432 SOEs that had to be equitized by the end of 2015. However, the total number of SOEs to be equitized had been raised to 532, according to a Prime Minister's decision in June last year regarding the criteria and list for the classifications of SOEs. For the first 10 months of last year, SOEs divested over $112.5 million, nearly 2.5 times higher than that in all of 2013. SOEs should pull state capital out of securities, finance and banking, insurance, real estate and investment funds. A total of more than $679.5 million has to be divested from non-core business operation this year. It's a pleasure to have you with us in our show today.
Thank you for inviting me.
The government's SOE restructuring plan for the period between 2014 and 2015 is to equitize 432 SOEs. However, until December 25th last year, only 143 SOEs were equitized. What's your overview of this process last year?
Well, I think one needs to put the amount of equitization that was possible in 2014 in a historical perspective. Certainly, there has been an acceleration in the number of equitizations. In 2013, for example, only 74 SOEs were equitized, and as you said, in 2014, 143 SOEs were equitized. Only 40 of those equitizations took place in the first half of 2014. So certainly there was an acceleration in the process. At the same time, I think one needs to keep in mind that the regulatory framework for SOE equitization took a little time to put in place. There were delays in some of the decisions, delays in some of the instructions from the various authorities. At the same time, some of the SOE enterprises were not able to submit their SOE equitization plans on time or restructuring plans on time, and some of them actually did not submit the plans at all. So there is lots of work that needs to be done.
So what's your take on the equitization process of Vinatex, Vietnam Airlines, and some other major state-owned corporations last year?
I think one needs to keep in mind that each of these SOEs is different. They're different in terms of their financial situation. They're different in terms of the amount of interest that investors have in these enterprises. By and large, the market seems to think that these SOE equitizations and IPOs went pretty much as expected. Besides the big names, there were a lot of other companies that were equitized in the construction sector. So the government did make an effort across a broad range of sectors.
So what do you think about the foreign investors' interest in buying stakes from state-owned enterprises in Vietnam?
Well, based on the equitizations that took place in 2014, clearly there was not a whole lot of interest from foreigners. Most of the IPOs were subscribed to by domestic investors, whether they were strategic investors or whether they were individual investors. So for the time being, there has not been a whole lot of interest by foreigners in the equitization process in Vietnam.
Why was there low interest from the foreign investors in SOE's equitization process in Vietnam?
The basic reasons relate to the fact that not enough information is provided by the authorities in terms of the valuation of the companies. There are also issues relating to how much ownership is allowed by foreigners in these companies. A foreign investor would be interested in taking a stake if they can take the company over and then turn it around. The objective from their perspective is to maximize the return on the equity that they put into the enterprises. There are limits on foreign ownership in the SOEs, equitizations, which makes it difficult both for them to assess in the first place what the value of the enterprise is, and after the equitization has taken place, to be able to make changes so that the enterprise can become profitable and that there's a good return on equity and return on assets for the investment in the enterprise.
So what have been the challenges of an SOE as it goes through the equitization process?
Well, the equitization is a complex process, and the process becomes even more complicated when we are talking about large enterprises which span a number of different areas. For example, Vietnam Airlines has operations in a number of areas. The Airports Corporation of Vietnam has operations across different streams. One of the first issues that arise is how do you look at the corporation as a whole? Does it have consolidated statements that it can show that it is making a profit, or if there are losses, what the level of losses are, or if it has debt, what is the level of debt for the group as a whole? Because each of the companies in the group affects the performance of the entire group. There are various steps in the process of equitization. First of all, a decision has to be made. It has to be cleared by the government. And then there is a long phase of implementation of the decision that has been made. Finally, of course, there is the post-equitization processes. To give you an example, from the point that the books are closed in terms of finding out what the value of the company is and to be valued by an independent auditor or a valuation company, it takes about, to the IPO, which is finally put into the market, it can take as much as 18 months or 1.5 years. So it's a long process. And each of these steps can have problems as one goes along.
So what do you think about the government's efforts to accelerate the equitization process of SOEs last year?
I think overall it is something that is welcome. I think the decision that was made in 2011 as part of Resolution 11 to stabilize the economy and also to accelerate the process of structural reform is now beginning to take some shape. I think in 2015 the government will need to show the same determination to move the process along, and perhaps to show more determination than in 2014. At the same time, the government will need to maintain macroeconomic stability so that the process can move along in a smooth manner and that the business climate and the climate for investors in Vietnam is favorable and also is attractive to foreign investors.
According to the latest report from the National Steering Committees on SOEs reform, 100 more enterprises has been added to the list of SOEs that must equitize during the 2014-2015, bringing the total number to 532. Among the difficulties facing this ambitious task is the valuations of the firms and their human resources.
Có một số cái đặc điểm mà có thể nói hiện nay là đang gây những cái khó khăn cho các doanh nghiệp cổ phần hóa, tức liên quan đến vấn đề ví dụ là vấn đề về giá trị sổ sách và giá trị mà tài sản khi cổ phần hóa. Bởi vì là đây là cái thời điểm mà không phải thuận lợi cho cổ phần hóa, bởi vì giá của tài sản là đang giảm. Ngoài ra thì cái vấn đề về nhân sự, nếu chừng nào ban giám đốc hay là ban quản trị mà thực sự mà vẫn còn bị phụ thuộc vào phần sở hữu của nhà nước ấy, thì cái nhân sự của chúng ta vẫn bị phụ thuộc theo cái gần như là cách cũ. Chúng ta rất là khó có thể có một cái sự thay đổi đột ngột hay là thay đổi mạnh mẽ.
Although the process of equitization has accelerated in 2014, more is still needed to be implemented, especially in terms of policies.
Để mà thúc đẩy nhanh hơn nữa, chúng tôi cho rằng là cần phải làm thêm những cái động tác mới. Ví dụ như là công khai hóa tất cả các phương án và thực hiện tuyên truyền mạnh mẽ, rộng rãi, cộng với những cơ chế khuyến khích, kể cả các nhà đầu tư nước ngoài. Thứ hai nữa là thực hiện những cái chính sách mà đảm bảo quyền lợi cho những người có liên quan, nhất là cán bộ cộng với công nhân viên chức và những người lao động, để tự họ trở thành cái động lực thúc đẩy cái quá trình này thay vì cản trở.
Phong also believed in more measures in countering corruption so as to prevent the abuse of public property and avoid wasting state budget.
What is the role of SOE equitization process? How can it contribute to Vietnam's economic development in the long term?
The first important thing is that it will increase the size of the stock market. It will raise the size of the capital market, the introduction of private interest in the state-owned enterprises, to the extent that these investors are able to shape the state-owned enterprise, will lead to better efficiency, more operational efficiency. We know that state-owned enterprises are less efficient compared to the private sector or the foreign investor enterprises, FDI. So I think from a longer-term perspective, the equitization process has to be moved forward, and perhaps the control that private investors have in some of these enterprises need to be more. In the long run, it would be good for growth. It would be good for the efficiency with which the resources of Vietnam are used. Vietnam has very favorable dynamics. People are looking for higher standards of living as they go forward. And I think improving the efficiency with which resources are used in Vietnam is important for achieving that objective. And SOE equitization and improvements in the efficiency of SOEs and private sector participation are important contributors to achieving that goal of higher growth and higher living standards in Vietnam.
Latest report from the Steering Committee for Enterprise Reform and Development last December shows that the number of SOEs to be equitized would be added 100 to 532 for the period between 2014 and 2015. And this means that each day the government has to equitize 1.09 enterprises. What do you think about this ambitious goal?
As you rightly say, it is a very ambitious goal. At the same time, I think one needs to keep in mind that the SOE equitization processes or structural reforms in the SOE sectors usually take a little time to take off. The number of SOEs that could be equitized in the second half of 2014 was almost double, or perhaps more than double, that the amount that could be equitized in the first half. And certainly the determination of the government is a very important factor in moving the process along. At the same time, the legal framework or the regulatory framework now is probably almost in place. There are certain modifications that are required to accelerate the process. If there are equitizations before, it sets the trend for the equitization that will come later. So I think the process gets a little bit easier as one goes along, but certainly the determination of the government is very key in terms of moving the process forward. It's certainly an ambitious target, and we'll have to wait till the end of 2015 to see whether the targets are met or not. At the same time, I think one needs to ask the question, if the real goal is the number of equitizations or the content of the equitizations, and that's something we would like to see more of in 2015.
So what is the global and local economic context this year that could help the government achieve this goal or make it harder?
Well, certainly macroeconomic stability in 2013 and 14 have helped, and if that can be continued into 2015, that would be an important factor domestically. From a global standpoint, I think there is plenty of liquidity in global capital markets. Certainly the interest in Vietnam has been quite strong over the last few years, and it is likely to remain so in 2015 as well. At the same time, the return on many of the other assets in the global economy are coming down, for example, on government bonds in the US, in Germany and Japan. So investors are looking for higher returns and alternative instruments to put their resources into. But domestically, again, I think the government will, besides the macroeconomic stability, will need to make sure that the accountability of the SOE enterprise management is increased further. So that they put forward reasonable valuations which are attractive to investors, certainly not selling the SOE enterprise at very low prices, but much more realistic in terms of what can be expected from investors.
2014 witnessed two huge initial public offerings for Vinatex and Vietnam Airlines. This is part of efforts to complete the government's plans in equitizing 532 SOEs during 2014-2015. Several stock market experts have a very positive outlook.
Về tiến trình cổ phần hóa doanh nghiệp nhà nước thì chúng tôi cho rằng nó có hai cái tác động đến thị trường chứng khoán. Những cái tác động thuận lợi thì có thể thấy là nó tăng thêm những cái nguồn cung hàng hóa chất lượng cao cho thị trường, đặc biệt là những cái ngành mà đúng cái định hướng phát triển của nền kinh tế Việt Nam, cũng như có rất nhiều triển vọng trong năm 2015. Ví dụ những ngành về dệt may, rồi những ngành có phần mang tính độc quyền trước đây, ví dụ như là viễn thông.
Moreover, the IPOs of many SOEs could make the stock market more attractive to foreign investors.
Chúng tôi nghĩ rằng là trong năm tới thì các nhà đầu tư nước ngoài cũng khá quan tâm, đó là việc xuất hiện các cơ hội đầu tư mới. Cơ hội đầu tư mới ở đây thể hiện là thông qua đi cùng với các cái tiến trình cổ phần hóa các doanh nghiệp nhà nước, rất nhiều những cái IPO lớn sẽ được tiến hành. Cái lộ trình thoái vốn của SCIC cũng như mà khi thị trường hồi phục thì các cái tập đoàn tư nhân người ta cũng sẽ đại chúng và niêm yết, thì cái điều này tạo ra một cái nguồn cung hàng hóa với chất lượng ổn định với nhiều cái doanh nghiệp tốt có quy mô lớn và làm tăng cái quy mô của thị trường. Và khi mà cái thị trường mà đạt một cái quy mô đủ lớn thì nó lại thu hút được nhiều những nhà đầu tư nước ngoài lớn tham gia.
Three other IPOs most anticipated among stock market insiders due to take place later this year are Vietnam Mobile Telecom Services, or Mobifone, Vietnam National Shipping Lines, or Vina Lines, and Vietnam National Coal and Mineral Industries Group, or Vinacomin.
What was done well in the equitization process in 2014 that should continue this year?
I think certainly the determination of the government should continue. More efforts need to be made to improve the operational efficiency of the enterprises so that they can be seen as viable instruments for investors. There have to be clearer accounting, more consolidated accounting, better accounting, more disclosure. Also, the information on the state-owned equitization process is quite scattered. There is a committee in the Office of Government which is responsible for the overall process. It would be good to consolidate all of the information on SOE equitization at one place so that investors can see what has been happening in terms of the equitization process and get a better consolidated, aggregative feel for how the process is going. So more information on the part of the government, more information on the part of the enterprises, and certainly a strong determination from the government are required in 2015.
So besides information transparency and determination from the government in terms of legal framework, what are your recommendations for the acceleration of the SOE equitization process this year?
Certain improvements could be made. I think the consideration of higher foreign ownership limits would allow for more foreign investor interest in the country. I think making sure that the enterprises which are equitized are listed on the stock market would accelerate the process of providing information. An enterprise that has to list on the stock exchange, for example, now 1 year is the limit. They have to, after the equitization, in 1 year they have to list on the stock exchange. But it's not really imposed quite strictly. And therefore the amount of information that comes out on the financial situation of the SOE that has been equitized is not adequate for the market to get a good sense of whether the valuation was correct or not. So tightening the limits, tightening the restrictions on the SOEs, making the enterprises more accountable would go towards improving the process and providing more information to investors in 2015.
What are the experiences that similar countries in the region may have in restructuring SOEs that Vietnam can learn from?
An important process in terms of SOE equitization and moving the process forward is that the enterprise needs to face a hard budget constraint. That makes the enterprise much more focused on efficiency. For the time being, the state-owned enterprises still obtain favorable treatment from the government, either in terms of subsidies or cheap land or capital. All of these things make it very hard to finally assess how profitable the company is, what is the operational efficiency. So I think putting a hard budget constraint on the enterprises is important. Also, by the same token, making sure that the private sector has access to resources on similar terms. So a level playing field is important. So I think providing some information on how these state-owned enterprises compare with similar enterprises in other countries could help to set a benchmark, perhaps a more reasonable benchmark on valuations. So I think looking at the experience of other countries, disclosure helps a lot. proper valuation, good valuation helps a lot. Transparency helps a lot. So I think these are all things that can be improved, and these are lessons that one learns from successful equitizations in other countries.
Thank you very much for spending your time in our show today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Deputy Prime Minister Vũ Văn Ninh last month requested that relevant ministries, local authorities and leaders of corporations to take full responsibility for realizing the SOE restructuring target in the 2014-2015 period. This shows Vietnamese government's determination to speed up SOE reforms through equitizing SOEs and forcing SOEs to divest from non-core business operations. Despite some progress in the equitization process at major state business groups last year, SOE restructuring process last year was deemed slow, leaving much work to do this year. The Steering Committee for Enterprise Reform and Development will cooperate with the Ministry of Finance to enhance the SOE restructuring management of relevant agencies, local authorities and corporations. And that concludes this edition of Bizline this week. Thank you very much for being with us. Remember that you can always watch our show online at vtv4.vn or youtube.com/vtv4go. And from our team here in Hanoi, until next time.